I think that doing the educational piece around what is the actual legal definition of abandonment versus what is a perception emotionally, psychologically of abandonment, and how to give tools to both the clinicians and the patients on how to have that dialogue effectively so that they don't wind up truly being abandoned, because for the physicians this is clearly a med-legal liability. And I have definitely seen physicians acting from a place of, well, the new guidelines say I shouldn't be doing this, so I'm just not doing it, due to misinterpretation of the guidelines. I'm hoping that this guiding document will clarify that sufficiently so that people understand that it's not a black or white, all or none. But I think if, just like we said, we're going to pull out the opioid dependence definition out of here, because it's not truly a definition right now in the DSM. I think we need to be consistent in our decision-making process, and if that's the case, then we cannot put the definition of abandonment in here, because it's not a medical definition, it's a legal definition, and we may want to just put the caveat and say this is the medical the legal definition of this. There are other interpretations of the word abandonment, which we will reference in section X.
And we will capture that there's this legal definition of patient abandonment, but then there is sort of this colloquial use that folks are using and concerned about, and have that addressed elsewhere. Okay? We are going to take about a 10-minute break. Folks, there's food. You should eat it. And we will, folks on the phone, we're just going to take about 10 minutes, 7 to 10 minutes, something like that. And then we'll continue. This is very great discussion, guys. Thanks.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Well, you should have, by the way, when I talk to this person, right? Oh my God. I know, but the minute you hear it. I think you fall for it, like the falling.
Oh, that I can't remember. So I got this call from Gary, and I'm like, he said it's not.
Hey, well, it's not this one. It's break. Is everything okay?
I'm going to travel.
Oh, sorry about that. So you don't think she's going to be here? But you don't have to. And that's the thing.
I know.
Yes, that is a joy. Right, but she's not positive right now because of performance status, right? But so I usually sell those patients hospital guys. Meet criteria now. Does it mean that you would not meet criteria again? And the teachers will get stronger. But given, so I basically give them a which is palliative consultation and diagnosis, who are in the disease state. There's something that we push all courses of disease. Hospices for patients, palliative patients for those who have disease-modifying treatment available to them at this time, or they elect not to participate. And that's kind of the script that I use. With the understanding that all they have to do is okay.
I'm just writing back.
Because I know last time we were so afraid of it.
It's probably time for me to get some more fun. You know, I think it's
I used to do it in my head and then it gets the PowerPoint. Sometimes I go like, oh, that's totally working.
it's a way to organize my thinking. I start off with the first slide as I'm working. It's like all my, and then I start making slides and moving around and
That's why.
Really devil in
many of us.
I was staying on the high road.
I keep flying.
No, I don't. I would look for
Yeah, Portland, I do New York, so it's, I think the biggest actually, no, it's we could get better work.
So you one potential idea would be you put back on the table in the middle, and then you put
We only have 3 and 2.
yeah, and then you have two. And so
I do think what?
Yeah, it is just a
there's just a lot of this.
I agree.
we're gonna come back together.
That's why the two hot people right now finally, like, you turn it on, they wait a second, and they know. But they've been trained for like years with the stupid same mic.
All right, we're gonna come back together, folks. We're gonna come back together, folks. Get your chips, get your drinks, come back, sit down.
Get your walk.
Get your walk. Okay.
You disagree with everything. Well, I got that going for me.
Okay. The next so we have until 4:30, and so we'll just we have as far as I see, we do not have any public comment. We will I checked, if anything, staff team, if we see any public comment, please let me know, although I just checked, we don't have any. So we're going to go until 4:25, a couple of logistic things, and then we'll wrap it up. But we have some more good amount of time, and we are going to move to patient assessment and evaluation. Okay. And I think as we sort of continue to work, as Dana said, it's iterative, and if we find later that there are some definitions we need to add, we can, that sort of meet those criteria that we set out for definition, like has to be a real definition, right? That we can add it there. So the patient assessment and evaluation. There's a lot here. So it starts on page 3, and then goes to page 4. There's sort of different categories, and then on to page 5, and the top is 6. And so what was done here was, again, to sort of, the first section is pain assessment and evaluation, then psychosocial environment, co-occurring conditions. I'm sorry. So patient assessment evaluation, then on page 4, assessing and addressing opioid and substance use and opioid use disorder, substance use disorder. Then on page 5, psychosocial environment and co-occurring conditions. So there was just a lot of different pieces here, and so I think, and we can sort of see how this goes, we should take it, look at this first chunk on pain assessment and evaluation, and then move through it, okay? And we can see if we have to combine or reorder anything like that. Pain assessment and evaluation, we have something from the CDC, from the OPG, the VA, and Washington. And again, go to this question of, is there anything we want to adopt because we really like it? Is there stuff we want to tweak or combine? Or write something different? So let me give you guys a minute to look. Bottom of page 3, top of page 4.
Can I ask a clarifying
Absolutely.
question? When we say patient assessment, is this patient assessment to determine to taper or not taper? Maybe that's too, it's not, it just says patient assessment and then it goes through separate assessments. So I just want to clarify the purpose of the assessment.
I guess I have to put it back to you all. I mean, I'm not saying that you have. I mean, I think I'd say, what is the assessment? I think, but I'm open to what you guys. Jim.
So you've got this patient on high dose, and by definition they're in an unsafe place, and you've got to figure out what to do with them. Some people would say some of those patients are going to be assessed and are doing better, and the risk-benefit analysis would say keep them on the meds. I don't think Paul's one of those people. Or you may find when you assess them they really have opiate use disorder. I think it's the responsible thing to do. It allows you to figure out what path you're going to take. Most of the patients are going to end up in one particular path, and it also probably gives you tools as you progress down the tapering path. mean, you learn about your patient.
So how would you address Kim's query, which is, are you assessing to say to taper or not to taper? Are you assessing to determine your next steps? What?
Yeah, I guess you are assessing to taper or not taper, because if they have opiate use disorder, you're going to provide them with a different treatment. And again, I'm not in this camp, but some people would say that there's going to be a certain subset of patients that you should leave them well enough alone, and perhaps they're going to be your patient.
Please, Safina.
I'd imagine some sort of algorithm or something. Obviously, it's not going to be so cut and dry, but it's like assessing the patient so they need. So basically, do they have clinical condition that warrants opioids, yes or no, or do they have, like for example, there's, at least in my mind, there's certain clinical conditions that absolutely don't warrant opioids that you would want to take, or there's ones that could warrant opioids, right? Then you look at, so the clinical assessment, then you look at what dose are they on. So are they on too high of a dose, or are they on a relatively safe dose? Then you look at, are there elements of opioid use disorder or not? Like, so I'm not saying exactly what the algorithm is, but that could be part of the assessment to just start with people thinking about categorizing, do they have opioid use disorder? Do they just have chronic opioid use? Are they at a safe level of opioids? Are they not? Do you need a taper? Do you need to leave them alone? Do they even have a clinical indication to be on opioids in the first place, or is it just a random diagnosis? So it can lead people through just the initial categorization of that, and I think that something like that would be helpful to start this section.
Let me hear from Kat, then Katrina, then Minnie.
I was just going to say, like what the CDC had written, these are direct quotes out of Roger and the rest of their evidence-based review, recommendation 1 and 2, I think, and this is what we teach when we're teaching people about pain management and how to start people. So I think the languaging is good and it's supported by the literature.
Great. Katrina.
So remember that these are tapering guidelines, right? So this is not everything you need to. And I remember a comment last time. I remember who said it. So this is just standard medical practice, right? And I think the answer is it's very much the same principles, but we need to reiterate these are complicated patients. So again, referring to our previous guideline, this one is for acute pain. So the chronic pain is when to initiate or whatever. And I did actually look at the chronic guidelines as well. This is less about chronic and more about, remember, a tapering guideline. But we talked about with the acute guideline, evaluating the patient, identify cause of the pain, in this case acute pain, but you have to figure out what's causing these patients' pain. Severity, that would be current, etc., duration, age, other considerations, other medications, blah, blah, blah. So it's a little bit what Safina said. You have to figure out what are the potential physical causes, what are the psychosocial, there's a bunch of it. But because this is in a tapering guideline, I'm assuming that the reason you are doing an assessment is to think about tapering the patient in either how quickly, how long, what are the other considerations that you need to while tapering the patient. So, yeah.
Minnie.
There's no mic.
That's
I'll
okay.
just.
It's
fine. It's
you
fine.
have a phone near
Yeah.
you, so you're okay.
So I think the reason the pain assessment is important is because if somebody sees a guideline and says, I need to taper my patient, and they might have, and I've seen that in our practice, because when the VA came up with these guidelines, there were these random tapers that occurred, and suddenly people were being tapered to 0 without any pain assessment. So when we review charts, we try to go back and see, has there been a pain assessment? This person's been on 120 MEDs, but nobody has written anywhere why they were given 120 MEDs. So I think when somebody's tapering, it's important to actually do an assessment, why they have pain, just like Safina said, what's their history of their pain, and what treatments they've had, including the non-pharm treatments. And the biopsychosocial assessment is really important before you begin the tapering process. And you might find patients that are functional if you're looking at and if I have a patient who holds a job, has a social life, is doing everything, and is on 90 MEDs, I might just leave them alone because then they're not at really high risk.
So it's all these different components. With
Yeah,
the
I
pain
think we need to
assessment, the
put all of
psychosocial.
them together.
Exactly. And what? Go ahead. So I got Paul and then Katrina.
The terminology, there's been another work group, and one of the terminologies we came up with was a risk-benefit analysis.
Yeah.
And I would like to weave that in because I think it's salient, and I think we're going to come to using Bravo. So I think rather than patient assessment and evaluation, or maybe with the subtext risk-benefit analysis.
So in that CDC recommendation number 1, and maybe we have to say it more explicitly, the second sentence is, and maybe this doesn't exactly get it, Paul, but should consider opioid if expected benefits are anticipated to outweigh risks.
Where are you?
So I'm at the bottom of page 3, patient assessment evaluation, and then the first bullet is pain assessment and evaluation, and then the CDC, what the CDC uses, and I think what Kat was saying, maybe we should adopt it, for the pain assessment piece, right? Knowing that there's all these other pieces. This, under recommendation 1, the second sentence talks about benefits and risks.
Yeah, there is risk on page 4, bottom.
Yeah.
I don't see the risk. I don't see the mention of risk.
Recommendation 2, pain and functionalities risk.
It's actually in both.
It's in
both.
both. It's in recommendation 1
Recommendation
and
8.
recommendation 2.
Okay.
Recommendation
Okay.
8.
Katrina.
Just a very quick comment, and again, I started here because we've done all these other guideline work already. There was a long discussion at our previous guideline, this was the acute one, about the pain scale, and we decided adamantly against that sort of pain scale. But I just wanted to say that there are those kinds of assessments out there, as we well know, and we had a long discussion about it. So I just, part of it, and what we boiled down to was what I read a minute ago. Again, that was for acute pain, but I think really focusing on this assessing not only what are the physical causes, what are the treatment, what's the long term, what's the psychosocial, et cetera. That's what we mean by assessment within the context of a tapering guideline.
Go ahead, David.
So I like Safina's approach where you have sort of an algorithm. The first question is, does this patient need to be on opioids for pain to start? And I think we ought to refer to existing rather than repeat. So if the CDC is fine by me, and maybe there's a link
Yes.
to our already our existing guidelines, and we leave it at that because people, we don't need to reinvent the wheel every time.
Yep.
And so it's sort of a yes/no. When you do that assessment, which is documented how to do it elsewhere, do you end up with this patient needs to be on some sort of pain management or not? If it's not, then that's a clear question. And that's a clear, maybe you need to come off. So, but I mean, we're building an algorithm, so this is building.
That's great. Good.
Well, and I think we should go off the tools we have, because if we put too many new things in here
Good.
with everything that's out there, we're just going to confuse people. So I think if we can pull from existing things and just kind of make this a document that compiles that appropriate for opioid tapering, I think that'll be helpful.
DJ.
I was just wondering, to use the algorithm, are we kind of skipping over the first step because it's basic, but defining who you should apply the algorithm to? This is for people who are on chronic opioid therapy or chronic pain. And also we can exclude some special populations right off the bat. So, these guidelines do not apply to people on MAT. These guidelines do not apply for people at MLA, et cetera.
Yeah.
That's kind of step 1. Is who should you consider this algorithm for?
And more than that, that's great. And more than that, that's really like the first sentence of the entire
Document.
Yeah.
Yes. First
sentence. Well, that is for people on.
And repeated under this.
Could you say that again so we make sure?
Yeah, so it would
people
be
on chronic.
essentially people on chronic opioid therapies for chronic pain,
Chronic non-malignant pain.
which is consistent with other guidelines that we've seen. That these are the groups that are excluded.
I think the only point I would like to echo of Minnie's is that the number of patients who kind of make their way from physician to physician to hospital to different system, where the real fundamental why are they on this in the first place gets lost in translation it's so perverse how much that happens, that I almost feel like if you're going to make a decision to take someone off of it or continue it, really defining what is the pain source, has it been worked up adequately, do you have the documentation to support that diagnosis, because half the time the diagnosis I'm seeing has nothing to do with what they're presenting to me with. So I really think it should include a reevaluation of the diagnosis, the workup, and the support for that patient being on it or not, because I think that will play into the algorithm. I think my favorite story is some 23-year-old who I saw in the ED who came in for a refill of Norco, and I'm like, why are you on Norco? She's like, oh, I hurt my knee when I was 16 years old in a car accident. And I'm like, who has been prescribing you these drugs for the last 4 years? Like, not reassessing this, not deciding if it's appropriate or not. It just kept getting passed on from provider to provider. So I would like to take this opportunity to call out, do we support this diagnosis? Is the workup there to enforce that opinion or not?
What I'm hearing is a couple things. So that you'd have this algorithm. So first of all, being super clear who this applies to, right? At the beginning, also that we would have a thing for special patient populations, right? Number one. Number two is that that you'd have some sort of, in this section about patient assessment evaluation, maybe some visual that sort of here's the if this, then this, if this, then that, right? But then supported by some of the existing, and this is I want us to look at this and say, because that looks like this wouldn't be helpful, right? It's too dense, it's too much. But you know, do we want? And I'm just going to make this up. Okay, so you have the algorithm, then you have sort of the supporting documentation about pain assessment and evaluation. Okay, let's use the CDC one. Okay, and again, making it up, on assessing, and let's use the one we use for acute prescribing. I mean, I don't know what they are, but I think you have to try to winnow this, so we can do something visual, or whatever the algorithm looks like, and then have this as supporting documentation. Does that make sense? So with that,
the principle is exactly what Adrian just said, right? The principle that we're trying to catch in the first thing is that we've got to establish that this patient is on opioids, on pain management for an evidence-based reason, right? That's the principle, right? And that means going through their chart, whatever, but that's what we have. That's the
step
start.
one.
That's step one, right? It's really simple.
Okay, but what happens when you discover that there's no good reason and there they are on high-dose opioids? I mean, I think it's very important to know that, and yet I think you're going down the same road, which is, boy, we got to taper this person off because there never was a good reason.
That's tapering them off. That's not tapering them down.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, that's
tapering them off versus down.
Yeah. That's a whole
Like
different
get to a safe
endpoint.
level versus.
Right. Yeah.
Go
ahead, Paul.
So when I go through the last 240 patients that were sent to me on high-dose opioids, about 60% met criteria for fibromyalgia. So they shouldn't have been started on the opioids to begin with. But once they're on high-dose opioids, and back where Jim is, it's all risk. There's no benefit. There's no data to suggest benefit. So everybody's going to taper or transition to buprenorphine. So in the context of high-dose opioid patients, it doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. If it's a chronic non-cancer pain, risk exceeds benefit. If you don't believe that, show me evidence that high-dose opioids are efficacious. There isn't any.
Well, but high-dose opioids is different than like being on 150 more MED is different than being on 60 MED.
I don't care about 60. You know, honestly, I'm at this committee because I'm worried about the high dose. I don't care about, you know, to me, I'd say amnesty. If you're within CDC guidelines, you get amnesty if there's no aberration.
Well, then we need to call that out somewhere because I think a lot of providers are not only going to be looking at this from a high-dose opioid perspective, they'll be looking at everything.
Yeah, so then I think it's fine to include that, but the concern is when they're outside. If you're a believer, if you're a true believer, that's when that guy gets involved. That's the thing that concerns me.
Yeah. Then that point, I think this point is super important to call out under definition or under something in the beginning of the whole point. The point of this is to is not, yes, as indicated, we want to discontinue when it's indicated, but the first and foremost is to get people off of high-dose opioids down to the safe level that's evidence-based by the data that exists in the world right now, which is reflected in the CDC guidelines, and that type of statement should be included right after BJ's statement.
So
mine's first.
Yeah.
I'm gonna check this with folks. I want to hear from Kim and then Dana.
Well, I was just going to say, this not to add another piece of confusion, but at some point we're going to have to define what our high dose is. Because even when you look at CDC versus what OHSU has done, with the VA versus the Oregon Board, there's different MABs written in all these documents.
Yep.
So we're going to have to settle on that too.
Go ahead, Dana.
That's okay. You can go.
Well, I would, high dose on somebody who doesn't need it is something, anything. Right. So,
Any dose
I mean,
of
that
something
20-year-old is going to become a 30-year-old on
Correct.
much more.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I don't think we're getting.
So hold on a second. Let me hear from Dana.
I think just on that point, I want to say, I think this is important context, and when we finish the document, we can be sure what's first, second, third statement. But I know, I totally get that. But I think we should capture kind of the themes and the clarity that we want at the end of the doc when we finish this. But I do think these questions about, are we only talking about high dose? What does high dose mean? Are we talking about low dose in people who don't where there's evidence of harm? Those we're going to get into as we talk about when to taper and how to taper. I think those are going to be critical substantive conversation that we're going to need to have next meeting or two.
I think they tie into assessment though, because if you're, somebody in a low dose that's calling me at 4:59 against their drug contract on a Friday for a refill is going to send a red flag to me, right? And so if I start seeing that risk benefit ratio shift for me through behaviors, or I'm going to see things happening in a PDMP or in a drug test, then the dosage doesn't matter. And it goes back to this assessment. So they do go together in some way. This is where I get to disagree with you. Low dose does not get amnesty if they're not. We're giving them a drug that could take their life, right? And so they need to. Through assessment, they have to be able to demonstrate that they're following through, right?
I want to follow up on that because OHA came up with some guidelines that are very controversial. The guidelines that everybody that has Medicaid isn't going to be paid for, their opioids aren't going to be paid for. I don't want to be part of that battle. That you guys did that. I didn't do that. I disagree with that, and that's why I'm saying I think we need to pick our battles, and because being looked at nationally. Stanford's really running us up the flagpole.
They're running the HERC up the flagpole, not me.
But so I think we need to pick our battles. Where's the most harm? Pick the low-hanging fruit. It's high dose, whatever we agree high dose is. Grandma taking 5 Vicodin in a day, that's not my problem. Do you realize what I've seen? 4,200 milligrams a day, 3,500 milligrams a day, 800, 1,000. To me, let's address the big problem first before we worry about grandma or cutting everybody off.
Hold on. So I'm going to hear from Dana and then Ariana, and I'm going to bring us back a little bit. This is important conversation to sort of highlight where some of these challenges are. But I want to hear from Dana and then Ariana.
Just for a point of clarity, Paul, and I understand completely your context, but just a point of clarification because there's been a lot of misunderstanding about the HERC's work, and I just want to be clear that per your comment, the HERC has not passed policy that says everybody in opioids need to be taken off. So I know that's not, I understand where you were going with that, but because we're a public meeting, I want to make sure that I'm clarifying that publicly.
We're a public meeting, but I get calls from our local OHA group saying you got to taper this patient.
I completely agree that there are consequences of policies that have been passed, intended or not. So I hear you completely, but I also feel the due diligence to clarify.
So, I have a slightly different vantage point than Paul. We seem to be on slightly different sides of this. Yes, I'm extremely worried about these very high dose patients, but percentage-wise, in terms of the number of people who are in that much trouble, is smaller than the number of people that we are seeing who are on that intermediate, not quite catastrophic level, but not the lowest possible dose. And when I look at a population health perspective on this, I want to stop those people from becoming your next patient. And I think that if we really only target the folks that are at the far right extreme of this, we're missing an opportunity to impact a much broader community of patients who are struggling. And while from a health plan perspective, which will speak to David, yes, that end that's all the way on the far end of this bell curve are the highest financial cost to our systems, which is why healthcare systems will care about targeting those people. But again, when you look at that end relative to the number of patients impacted, I think there are competing interests here as to who we should be targeting.
So yeah, I want to hear from Katrina, and then I have a suggestion for something. Go ahead, Katrina.
And
so
I
my suggestion is we can provide data on this. We have the PDMP, and so if it would be helpful next time, we can tell you how many patients are on greater than 1,000 MED, what the different categories, what patients are on chronic. So that will potentially help this conversation. All the people who get doses and how many are on long-term and how many are on high-dose long-term, etc. So I don't know. We will look at those data and come up with some categories for you all. If people have strong opinions about what cutoffs they would like to see, we can absolutely have our staff in the PDMP run those numbers so that at least we know, are we talking about 10 people and they all go to Paul, or are we talking about 1,000 people, or are we talking about a million?
So here's what we're going to do. Okay, so there's a couple different things we're talking about. One is what is a high dose, like, and when, right? So there's this issue of if someone needs opioids because they have the condition, right? They have a condition that needs it, and then we say, okay, let's make sure it's safe, right? You need it, it's going to be safe. Then taper down, I think what somebody said, and then you have folks who may not need it, right? For the underlying condition isn't there anymore, and that's a different decision. And then you have folks who are on different levels of opioids, right? We know that. And I think part of what we're sort of circling around here, and I'm going to actually end this piece of the discussion because we're going to come back to it, but which is what's high? What are we going to say is high, right? We're going to come back to that. We're going to have that discussion. But I think we should have some of this data. And I think, some of the evidence and we don't have on here, I don't think, sort of what those other guidelines says. Oregon said something, CDC said something, whatever it is. I want you guys to have that in front of you when we have this specific conversation. Okay? What I want to see if, I know I still had Safina and Jim. So if you guys have quick comments, we can do that. I want to bring us a little bit back to this patient assessment piece, absent what the definition of high is, because we have to talk about that. So let me hear from you.
It's very quick, and I would just say when we get to it, I think that this should be inclusive, but we could be very clear about calling out both, like the super high, and that's the concept of risk stratification, and we have to get people within organizations to look at who do you target first. So maybe if you have a limited amount of resources, you target these people first, but you don't ignore these people forever. You have to then target these people too. So I think that there's, in whatever section it'll make sense later, we could call that concept out so that it's inclusive, but has people say where to go first.
And so maybe something the planning team can do, you guys tell me if this is okay, is to sort of help maybe organize that and look at what the existing guidelines say about what, or the data says about what's super high, maybe, I don't know what the categories are, but we could bring that back to you guys with the accompanying data. Jim?
I appreciate that the CDC drew some lines in the sand, but in reality, I don't really think the dose is the issue. I think the issue is safety. But I spent 25 years working with people with opiate use disorder, and I can tell you there were people injecting heroin that were happy that there was a doctor giving them 20 milligrams of oxycodone a day for the last 20 years, and that just sort of helped, So
I think I think as long as opiate use disorder is always worked into the algorithm, then maybe the dose won't matter so much. But we don't want people sitting there at 40 milligrams happy to clam who are really abusing the drugs.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And it's all part of the assessment, right? And that's what we were talking about, that it's not just, I mean, even if you look, it's not just one thing that you would look at with a patient. And if you think about, again, the audience for the guidelines, what you sort of, the providers and a piece of it, patients, but providers saying, okay, I don't have as much experience as all of you. What are the, sort of, what's the algorithm? What are the 5 things or the 6 things I have to look at? And then what are the considerations under each one of those things? And I know it's not that cut and dry, but I think that's where we're trying to get to in this section.
Well, I think Safina put it perfectly, and I think that this is really what should be sort of our goal, is to create this algorithm. Justified opiate management, not justified opiate pain management. If it's justified, then risk stratification and triaging based on functional performance assessments that are objective and are clinician driven. And then based on that, using the data that Katrina will give us, literally creating, just like I would in the ED, a triage system. If you fall into the red flag zone and I have lights and sirens going on, this is the algorithm you need to follow. If you fall into this category, this is what you're going to follow. And then I think that will also be more palatable for systems to approach, because you can't, again, target everybody all at once, but maybe then each individual system, clinic, will be able to say, okay, what can I do with the resources I have based on where this falls in the algorithm?
Please, Kim.
We could even maybe write a section that says, okay, I know you're confused about 120 MEDs or 90 MEDs, and even kind of write that out, that like at some point maybe we don't even worry about that if we decide we want to say that, but look at more risk versus benefit and other things, and not so much the number.
That's a great
We
point.
may want something like that.
That's great.
Well, we could state what all the different numbers are too if we wanted to have those there.
This is the range between these multiple organizations.
That
but
people are looking at for safety, exactly.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. So in our last, we're going to say 10 minutes, and then, because we have 5 minutes at the end, just to do some logistics and housekeeping. So if you look at page 3, 4, 5, and top of 6, the first question I want to ask you, I'm going to sort of back us up a little bit. Are those the right categories for the algorithm? Pain assessment and evaluation, assessing and addressing opioid, other substance use and opioid disorder, substance use disorder, sorry, that's really long, psychosocial environment, co-occurring conditions, that those are sort of the big buckets, and maybe we're missing some things, but is that a place to start? As in the assessment, these are sort of the categories you have to look at. And we'll organize it so you can see that. And then obviously some of the foundational questions that we discussed. So then, if you have those, do y'all want to then say, and I'm making this up, I'm just putting it out there for discussion. You know what? Let's use the CDC. Let's adopt the CDC for all of these. I'm making this up just for the sake of discussion. Or you say, I like CDC for the first, I like OPG for the second, I like CDC plus OPG for psychosocial. I don't have an opinion. You guys are the experts. So does anybody on pain assessment and evaluation have an opinion about what you want to use? And then we're going to go through the rest of them. So on page 3, pain assessment and evaluation. Kat, I think, said, CDC, we should use CDC. Just putting it out there. Who's ready? Go ahead.
I'm timid now.
Don't be timid.
Just to comment about the general categories.
Yeah.
I think some language around functional assessment would be helpful.
Good.
So that we're focused on that, because I think we should also focus on that as we taper, and this can set that stage. And then seems like the other sections are about risk, and so there's some objective risk assessments and other subjective things. An MED might be a really objective thing because you can calculate it. but you don't want to overlook those because there's a patient in front of you who may have other behaviors that are risky that may not be captured in those functional assessments and evaluations. And an example I would use is that I've seen so many patients that have the ORT done, and then it says, okay, they're low risk, and so they can get whatever they've been getting. When they're clear opioid use disorder criteria that are met, they're being overlooked because their ORT, which is really just their risk for developing that condition, is low. When they actually have the condition, low risk doesn't mean no risk. And so not to overly rely on these objective criteria of risk to really evaluate the function of the patient in front of you and the diagnosis that you see in terms of risk.
Good. Yeah, we can add that. Opinions on which definitions you guys want to use or would you tweak?
So,
Give me some.
I think the definitions are less important than the title of the definition, because basically what we're saying is think about this.
Yes.
And they're not going to actually look at the definition and think about it because of the definition. So we call out psychosocial.
Yep.
Whatever psychosocial means to them is what they're going to do.
Okay.
So we can fuss over it, but I don't think it's any utility.
Although
go ahead, eat, and then
I agree, and also I like the CDC definition of pain assessment because like the first words are focus on function, and so yeah, I want that to happen in the pain assessment. Focus on function. I just like that word a lot, and then it talks about risk and benefit stratification. So it's a really solid definition, and if all people read is pain assessment, then they did pain assessment.
Good. Okay.
But going to the psychosocial environment, to add to that, I actually like the OPG definition better than the CDC definition. And actually, I almost kind of want to throw in the VADOD one because they're really calling out very specific risks that someone who's less savvy about the PHQ-9 or 4 may not identify as clearly, like calling out straight out suicidal ideation and suicide attempt risk. I think are super important in this patient population because it's one of their biggest risks in us tapering them.
I'm tempted to make that category bigger, the psychosocial environment category, because we're not getting, well, at least I didn't see it in my kind of quick glance here, but I don't know that we're looking at, sort of the behavioral risks that might be outside of, these are a bunch of diagnoses of mental health disorders, but, what about funny PDMPs and funny toxicology tests? Where does that come in? Because maybe it could be a psychosocial/behavioral evaluation.
It should be under a category saying assessing risk.
Yeah, okay.
And because there's aspects of all of these things, there's aspects of, for example, to David's point, history of overdose attempts should be called out in big bold letters, not buried into assessment of OUD. And so if we had a assessment of risk and there's 10 things and they're big and bold without any words after them, but all of those things might be incorporated into the other definitions, then I think that'll help. I'm saying assessment of risk, if any of these things happen, people should be tapered. I think, or at least highly
supervised.
Think about taper.
So is there, so go ahead, Katrina.
Sorry, I was actually going back to this patient-centered diagram that we have here. One of the things that I didn't see under the psychosocial support was the involvement of family and friends. So I'm just thinking psychosocial part of this as well. You all have been talking about the risk, which is really important, suicide risk, so I'm not debating that. It seems to me a part of the evaluation, though, is also looking at the protective factors of which the social environment. So again, it's to get to this thing, if people are being tapered off, are they concerned about suicidal ideation or depression or whatever, and what else exists that could, so that's just another piece to add to this.
David, and then Kat. Or Kat.
Oh, I was just going to say, whatever we choose, I think we
Should call out which screening tools to use because it's helpful for the providers. It makes them not have to go and search and find out what the GAD-7, PHQ-9, and the PC-PTSD would be fine. Those would be good for them to be aware of.
David.
We had a conversation with the OPOL, the Oregon Psychiatric Access Line clinicians, psychiatrists, about who should be referred for MAT, and they called out people with schizophrenia should be referred. So there's a group of things you need to think about which doesn't really capture psychosocial. I think mental health is a separate category. I think people with suicidal ideation, especially active or chronic suicidal ideation, is a category of people who need to be thought about. People with schizophrenia or psychotic conditions, bipolar may be one. I'm happy to share the.
Yeah, would you?
But I mean, it is expert opinion. But I think what we're really, it's the headlines are what we need to really get out there. One of the things that was brought up was for MAT, if somebody has a history of homelessness and you can't really help them with their social supports, you may not want to go into something that's very structured with them because they can't do structure, they can't show up, right? So those are the kinds of things I think in this population we may want to think about: family supports, social supports. Those are the, maybe there's a tool that has all of that stuff. I don't know that there is, but I think for the guidelines, these are the kinds of headlines we want to be broadcasting.
The VA has those kind of tools.
Well, so maybe we
share with the class.
I can't because they're restricted.
They are
but
restricted.
The tool is,
okay.
There's a tool called STORM tool that we are mandated to look at. So STORM stands for Stratification Tool for Opioid Risk Mitigation. And they actually have all the mental health diagnoses. So the data actually is gathered from the electronic record. So we look at what's their mental health issues. So if they've got PTSD, if they've had suicide. I mean, suicide is huge in the VA, right? We're very conscious about that. So if there's a outreach program for the veterans. So if they've been enrolled in that program, that flags them. If they have PTSD, homelessness, all of those diagnoses, and then the physical diagnosis, if they have COPD, sleep apnea, congestive heart failure, and it doesn't matter if you're on 5-MeD. You're tracked there, and it'll give us a risk. What's the risk of this person having an adverse effect from the opioids in 1 year? What's their risk in 3 years? And so we have those tools.
But you said you can't share.
I can't because that's
just
pulling
wanted to be
data.
clear.
Well, no. I'm not asking you to share the data, but can you tell us what the?
I can tell you what the diagnosis.
What the diagnosis
Okay,
are.
so
That's what
we
it is.
can get the tool for
Yeah,
you
yeah.
to follow up. I want to be really mindful of your time, of your time, because I promised you to get out of here at 4:30. So, but we can get the tool.
Yeah, I can show you. I can tell you what's incorporated in
Okay,
that
so
tool
we will
because it's a
follow up.
data pool that occurs and it gives you the numbers.
We'll follow up on that. Dana.
Is that housed in our
I'm just looking at based on this conversation, we have 2 sections called out here for you guys. I was involved: psychosocial environment and then co-occurring conditions. And it feels like we've kind of overlapped this in some areas that was not perhaps very helpful. So co-occurring conditions may be better to call out mental health conditions and other physical health conditions. Psychosocial environment is probably more focused on these factors, social factors, other risk factors that have been identified, and we can reorganize it to maybe match that if you guys agree that was kind of the direction we're going. Okay.
I think one other thing to just, from a patient-centric perspective, there's so much stigma associated with the mental health-related issues that this is going to bring up that I'm just wondering, we can't put lipstick on a pig, for lack of a better word. If there is PTSD, if there's a history of suicidality, those are there. Is there a way to maybe make sure that the language we're using does not make those patients feel like, well, you're just saying that any of us who have had any of these issues ever in our entire lifetime are therefore relegated to XYZ? I don't know how to address that better, but I'm concerned that they will see us targeting potentially mental health concomitant coexistent diagnoses as an issue.
But it is an issue.
I agree, but we have to think about. I went a couple things that
Which is why I said you can't put lipstick on a pig. But
a couple things. There's going to be guidelines. We also talked about scripts, and so it may be in some of that the mindfulness about language and. That will come there. So here's what I want to propose. The next steps are. We've gotten really good feedback from you. I think maybe we have some ideas about reorganization. I also think that we have to get some more feedback. I think from you about which of these you like. But I think I think we made some good progress and can pull some things out. when we come together again, we'll review the work, we'll sort of do the review, and we'll also finish this piece, but then also start looking at when to consider tapering. Just on this couple final things, if there's any resources, especially concerned that are really relevant to what we just talked about, like STORM or any of these other stuff, all these other things, please let us know. I want 60 seconds of your time to tell me what worked about this conversation and maybe what didn't work about this conversation, because these are the kind of discussions we're going to be having for the next few months, sort of these like looking and digging in, and what I want to say about that, you can tell us what worked, you can tell us what didn't work, and like tell us what didn't work. If we're tough and we can like take that, right? So the first thing I want to hear is like, what worked? What worked about the way we had this discussion?
I think staff did a great job putting this together. I mean, I think that the start point of having this outline and the references and the actual language was a really good catalyst in the conversation. So we weren't just sort of giving an abstract question to answer, but we had things to work with. So kudos to staff. I know this is really hard. A lot of work put into it. So.
Yes, I totally agree.
It makes it nice to have something to start with. It's very organized.
Good.
I second that.
I also thought the facilitation was excellent because we kept moving forward, and I felt like there was time for people to speak, but not speak too much, and it felt quite productive.
Good.
Which is a huge accomplishment.
Good. What could we do better? Oh, anybody on the phone want to say what worked?
This is Michelle Marie Johnson. I really thought your outline and your preparation of what you sent out really worked well.
Great. What could we do better or
This was Helen, and I agree.
Thanks, Helen.
I just want to say one thing. I think that the seating format actually is much more engaging than I've seen some other, rows don't work. This works. Yeah.
Great. Great.
We played around with various different seating arrangements, so thank you. You don't know how much that comment's appreciated.
What could we improve or do differently? Yeah. Sound. Yeah, I'm lucky I didn't throw it out the window. You could have seen it.
Comic relief.
I know. Good comic relief.
We'll tell you that we have maybe 20 emails from this morning before we even got to this meeting about a need for better audio equipment, so we acknowledge and appreciate your flexibility in trying to work with it. I cannot promise we'll have it fixed by next meeting, but we are working on it, so thank you.
If not, we'll have the same stuff from Salem.
Thanks for the
it's
food.
Worth working on because it really makes participation from the phone much more meaningful.
Great, thank you.
I missed that, DJ.
Anything else we can? Any other thoughts about what we can do better?
It's not so much a better, but I really think having industry presence, I'm really appreciative of David's voice here.
Yeah.
I just feel like there are so many other industry representatives that what we put out, they need to be on board with, that I really am wondering if there's a way to engage more of, whether it be hospital leadership, executive, the folks from the Healthcare Leadership Forum, or someone representing a more diverse vantage point in terms of the payor aspect of this, because I really do think that where the tires are going to meet the road here is we can have the best expert guidelines on the planet. If they're not funded and supported, we're going to lose so much of what we're doing here.
Sorry to interrupt. I was thinking the OHLC, the evidence-based practice committee that's leading the health insurance recommendations on opioids.
Yeah.
Do we have that?
Thanks for the point. I just want to cut. David's not the only CCO representative here at the table. There's a couple, or 3 or 4, and other health systems are represented here. So just want to make sure that's clear. But I do want to say the Oregon Health Leadership Council, in particular, their evidence-based best practice subcommittee that has many representatives from hospitals, health systems, insurers are very much engaged in following this, really glad that it's happened. And while they may not be informing the direct language in here, they've been a very, they're anticipating this, and I think we'll be very glad to engage with it and help support its spread. So I will keep, I participate on behalf of OHA regularly in all those meetings and keep letting them know and updating them. So I don't, while they're not at the table, we offered and looked for interested applicants, but I think they wanted the expertise that you all have at the table to lead the content, but they're excited that this guideline is forthcoming, and I think excited to help spread that. So.
Our next meeting is May
23rd.
When is it?
It's May 23rd.
May 23rd.
Right before
No, it's got changed.
It got
That's
moved.
why I wanted to say it did get changed. You guys should have gotten.
That's you're on.
When is it?
When is it now?
So that was a highlight that I was given at the beginning. It got changed, and because there wasn't availability of the team to be present for the original date.
Is it the 23rd?
We're going to pause for 1 second and confirm.
I have it on the calendar as the 23rd.
I do too.
So all we need to do is check with the master, facilitators here, and if it's on her calendar,
it got moved.
It can be on a Saturday. It can be on May 11th.
No, it's on May 23rd.
There we go. It's the 23rd.
1:30 to 4.
We'll have
It's your birthday.
And we're going to sing Happy Birthday to Sophia. Thank you, everybody, so much for your time
Is it
and your
really the
good
day before
thinking.
birthday?
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, it's May 23rd.
Oh my gosh, what is
I have to be at a graduation at Berkeley on Friday, so we'll figure it out. Don't worry. I'll just drive it. We'll probably drive right after.
I mean, I can just go and I can put it in the